But people who've studied it, look at it, it's familiar, that discussion about hoaxes, scams, cover-ups, disinformation, propaganda, cons, the idea that there are hidden forces at work, secret powers, that you should follow the money. All of this runs across arguments about climate change. And a lot of the familiar tropes of conspiracy theory crop up time and time again. Scientists are a kind of mafia. My favorite line, if you're a scientist who doubts the consensus, you will wake up and find a polar bear's head in your bed. That's the kind of register for relatively mainstream climate denialism. It was a Pew survey which asked people in different countries in the world whether they thought that man-made climate change was a serious threat. And it was very striking how much it varied. From places like Pakistan and Egypt, where 15 or 16% of the population accepted it was a serious threat. So only a tiny minority of people thought that climate change was a serious threat. Through to South Korea, where 85% of people thought it was a serious threat. That is a huge spread. And Britain was in the middle, 50, roughly. But in this survey, America was divided into two countries, because it is two countries, the United States, Republican land and Democrat land. And in Republican land, only 25% of people accepted that climate change represented a serious threat 2 years ago. And in Democrat land, it was roughly 65%. What does Egypt, Pakistan, and Republican land have in common? What they have in common is that falling back on conspiracist explanations of how politics works is very, very widespread. So in our project, we have had people come to talk to us about politics in Pakistan, politics in places like Egypt, and the extent to which a complicated mix of factors, including colonial and post-colonial history, the relationship between the fragility of democracy and the prevalence of coups, suspicions of the United States, produce a kind of political climate in which conspiracist explanations are politics. I mean, why else would Pakistan and Egypt be the two countries where people don't believe in climate change? Unless they don't believe in anything that anyone tells them, because there's no reason to trust anyone in an official position, which is something that they have in common with Republican land when Obama is in the White House. Republicans, and there's no such thing as just generic Republicans, it really varies issue by issue, subject by subject. It depends what they have at stake. You know, you're much more likely to believe science is a conspiracy when you don't have the disease that the medical profession will tell you how to cure. Climate change is a hot button or a polarizing issue of our times, and we live in a very conspiracy theory-minded age. So what it tells us is that when you get one of these polarizing issues, the prevalence of this kind of talk shows us just how quickly we fall back on this kind of suspicious, follow the money, who are the hidden forces, who's a crypto this, who's a crypto that kind of language, because it's everywhere in our culture. So on that account, it's a symptom of something wider going on in the culture. That would be one kind of explanation. It tells us we live in a conspiracist age, conspiracy-minded age. And the other kind of explanation would be, it tells us something about the issue of climate change. There's something about that issue in particular that makes it prone to these kinds of accusations and counter-accusations. Climate change is an issue that puts a uniquely high premium on trust, if anyone's going to do anything about it. So it can be characterized, climate change can be characterized as an issue that has four unique characteristics to it, as a sort of politics, policy problem. You know, how are we going to solve it, if you believe it exists? It is uniquely long-term. That is, whatever we do now, the payoff, for better or for worse, will be a long way in the future. It is uniquely global as a problem. It's very hard to see how there could be a unilateral solution to climate change. It is uniquely uncertain to the extent that however much that consensus there might be about the causes and the motors of climate change, there is no agreement at all about the consequences, because no one knows. Now, if you read all of the mainstream consensus arguments, there are massive variations, fluctuations, differences about the level of risk, what the risk means, what it might translate into. And it's also uniquely irreversible in that the climate change that has happened, we're not going to turn it back. There doesn't look like there's any way to go back to where we were before. And a lot of these effects are already built in. I mean, we're trying to stop things, as it were, 20 years ahead, given that we have to assume that a lot of this stuff can't be stopped now. Which means that if you think that politicians and the established elite voices that tell us we should be worried about this, are going to be able to do anything about it. You have to put a huge amount of trust in their hands to deliver coordinated, long-term, globalized, serious action on this issue. You have to give them the power now, and then trust that they will use the power wisely for these uniquely long-term payoffs. And what that means is that what's most visible in the present is the transfer of power, not the consequences, and not the reason why the power has been transferred. And the other thing that is clear is that it puts this huge premium on trust, which means evidence that you can't trust politicians is hugely corrosive for a sort of reasonable discourse about these issues. So that's the space in which conspiracy theory flourishes, where there's a problem that requires certain capacities to solve, and then there is evidence that the capacities cannot be met by politicians. So then the question is asked, well, what are the politicians really up to? If there's a huge mismatch between the nature of the problem and the capacities that seem to exist for the solution. So climate change requires empowered institutions, and the conspiracy theory says that's the wrong way round. Empowered institutions require climate change. Like the only way the UN is going to get the power, the global power that it's always secretly wanted, is to invent an issue like climate change, which allows them to demand the power in the present for a future on which they're never going to have to deliver. And that's the conspiracy theory. I haven't had time to watch it. I don't know if anyone had time or the will to watch the Republican debate last night. This is the question. Isn't it time to take out an insurance policy and approach climate change the Reagan way? You can read that how you might, but it's like, isn't it time to start actually thinking about what could go wrong here? And even Chris Christie, who it was thought might come out and try and position himself against the rest, none of them were willing to say that they thought that this should be something on which they should commit themselves to action. And Marco Rubio gave an answer which said that he didn't believe it was something that American politicians should be committing themselves to. And Chris Christie said, I agree with Marco, we shouldn't be destroying our economy in order to chase some wild left-wing idea that somehow by ourselves is going to fix the climate. So there you get that kind of exactly the sorts of things I've been talking about. If this is genuinely a global problem, but you've got national politicians trying to empower themselves off the back of it, you need to ask yourself not what's the nature of the problem, but why are they using the problem to, it's a wild left-wing idea. And it's hugely polarizing. I mean, the fact that none of these people sought to capture the possible primary votes of the maybe up to 45% of Republicans who take this issue seriously is striking, that something is being squeezed out here. Climate change is an issue that's particularly vulnerable to accusations of hypocrisy. There are lots of gates out there, but ClimateGate is one of the few that has really got legs and has entered the language. ClimateGate is now quite a common appellation to describe a range of things, but I'm sure most people will remember originally to describe a tranche of emails that came out of the University of East Anglia that seemed to show that the peer review process was being corrupted by a group of scientists who were trying to conceal the level of doubt there is about the scientific consensus from the public. That became ClimateGate. Science is meant to be this neutral, apolitical way of viewing the world, evidence-based. Peer review is meant to be this kind of pure process where no one ever favours their friends and punishes their enemies, and of course we know that that's true. But on the climate issue, it exists in this climate of mistrust, of received wisdom, of consensus politics, consensus in terms of what the official line is on anything. And any scientist operating in that climate is going to have to think about the politicization of their subject. I mean, I don't think you can, as a scientist, remain neutral in a climate where your subject has been politicized, because your enemies will just gobble you up and spit you out. I mean, when I read the ClimateGate emails, I thought, well, of course they're thinking like this. I mean, who wouldn't think about how it looks in a world where how it looks is what drives the politics? If in a climate where politicians have to think like that because of the mistrust about the received version of things, it is discovered that politicians are thinking like that, you get another vicious circle effect. That confirms the doubters. That's what ClimateGate was. ClimateGate seems to me more a reflection not of how scientists think, but of how people think about scientists. That's what it tells you. But of course it confirmed the people who didn't trust scientists in what they think about scientists.